Hello, everyone. We're all here in Mountain View, California at LinkedIn headquarters, and I wanted to thank you all for coming to a very interesting conversation about the future of work. My name is Dan Shapero. I'm Vice President of Talent Solutions and Insights here at LinkedIn, and we're really here to talk about a very interesting trend in the global workforce. And as part of my role, I get to work with talent leaders around the world to understand how technology and platforms like LinkedIn transform the relationships that companies have with their current employees, as well as the type of talent that they want to bring into their organizations. So I couldn't be more excited to have today's conversation with Justin and Reid about how companies are changing the compact they have with their employees. And so for those of you in the room, welcome. For those of you streaming in live, if you'd like to participate in the conversation with either comments or questions, please use the hashtag #TheNewCompact. And so what we're going to do today is start the discussion with a dialogue between Reid Hoffman, Executive Chairman and co-founder of LinkedIn, and Justin Fox, Executive Director,
Editorial
Director at the Harvard Business Review. And we're going to do that for about 25 minutes, and then we're going to actually bring up a panel of practitioners in this space, people around the world that are figuring out how to think about their organizations as talent leaders and managing largely global and diverse workforces, and how do they think about evolving the way that they work with their employees. And this really came from Reid's recent book, The Startup of You. The Startup of You is a book that is all about employees thinking about deploying entrepreneurial strategies, just like startups do to become successful, for employees to embrace their career as if they are managing their own startup. And that prompted lots of questions for companies around how do they manage employees in that context to encourage entrepreneurial behavior? How do they change the way that they engage with the people in their global workforce to create a more nimble and agile team that can be faster and more nimble in today's dynamic economy? And so with that, excited to turn over the conversation to Justin to kick it off with Reid. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Dan. So Reid, with the Startup of You and now with this HBR article in our current issue on tours of duty, the new employee compact, you've been on kind of this tear lately about entrepreneurial employees and an entrepreneurial approach to the workplace. What brings that on, other than the fact that you live in the Bay Area?
Well, I mean, one of the advantages actually of living in Silicon Valley is it actually gives you a glimpse into the future. And so that's it's one of the things that I think triggers the insight. I think there are three trends that are changing the nature of kind of how talent and companies relate. One is, which we labeled as the entrepreneurial age, which is this increasing cycle of competition, disruption from technology, disruption from globalization, an increasing time frame by which you essentially need to have your companies respond at quicker and quicker rates. And one of the things that we referred to is what John Seely Brown and John Hagel referred to as the topple rate, which is the increasing rate by which companies fall out of the Fortune 500 in terms of speed over the sort of decades. And that's sort of the situation that all companies find themselves in globally. The second is the internet, where now everyone is connected online, having identities, social media, discovery of information, changing of workflows. And the third is, because essentially the former lifetime compact of, come work out of college, work at this company your whole life, is essentially in the process of changing everywhere, including in Japan. You now have a workforce that has to think like the Startup of You. And so what do those three things mean for how companies think about recruiting, identifying, recruiting, deploying, retaining, and managing their talent? And then, since, by the way, one of the consequences of the fact that it's now much more mobile and shifting around is also there are now significant corporate alumni bases and these sorts of things. And how do you think about all this, and what does this mean for the strategy by which companies should think about talent? Because the Startup view is how individuals should think about their work, their careers, and the Tour of Duty Compact is essentially one component of how companies should start thinking about how they manage talent.
So looking at the example that you've been living in for the past 20 years, what describe quickly, what is the Silicon Valley setup? What's the compact?
So, just to be clear, we're not saying everything should run like Silicon Valley. We're not that quite that parochial. But the
or
way
imperial.
Well, yes, probably not that either. So the canonical way that Silicon Valley operates is trying to figure out how do you get kind of a group of people together for a project by which you create something really substantial for that project. And the focal archetype of that is, in a sense, a startup, where the vast majority of people come together on a 4-year vesting schedule for their initial kind of stock grant in terms of what they're doing. Sometimes it's 5, rarely it's shorter than 4, and usually kind of special circumstances. And the goal is to actually create a whole set of different entities. In this case, there's the employees and the talent side, also the founders, also the investors, to collaborate on a project that usually takes about 10 years overall to come to some sort of strong fruition, although 4 years you begin to get a sense of major progress. And that's part of the reason why the kind of the collective, it's actually not a top-down decisioning, it's the kind of the collective, you almost say wisdom of the crowds sort of process in the Valley kind of ended up with, let's do a 4-year vest as a way of setting that in motion, because it gives a very long, get this project to a really strong place and then reevaluate where you are. And so that's how, and part of the way that the reason why Silicon Valley is so innovative is because it has this notion of, it isn't like, oh, you go and just work at one company your entire life. That's actually by far and away the exception rather than the rule here. It's that people move around from different companies and different projects, not at a quick tempo, but usually at a longer tempo, and therefore you can assemble a really great team in order to do a really great project. And people come in and out of companies. One of the things that Marissa's doing with Yahoo is she's actually trying to recruit back some of the star talent to another tour of duty at Yahoo under the kind of new management. Well,
and so that's this idea of the new employer-employee compact. One part is this idea of the tour of duty, and in Silicon Valley it's 4 or 5 years, but it doesn't have to be that time period in other industries, right?
No. Basically, part of the thing, so the basic idea on the tour of duty is not to say that people necessarily leave the company. It's one of the things that people frequently reflect as a tour of duty. Does that mean 4 years and you're gone? Actually, frequently, people will stay longer than 4 years after the initial vesting schedule. There's re-ups, there's other kinds of things. What it really is here is a mutual project by which a lot of value is added to the company and a lot of value is added to the talent. And the compact is essentially trying to have where the company builds out something really serious, and that the talent then makes serious progress in their career. And as we said in the HBR piece, also the way to think about it is to help them be lifetime employable. As opposed to lifetime employment, it's lifetime employable in terms of the way the compact works. And the key thing in terms of making this go is to say we both seriously invest in each other over this time cycle. Now, the question is, sometimes a time cycle might be shorter, and sometimes it might be longer, and it depends somewhat on the industry. It depends somewhat on we speculate a little bit on product cycles, like when can you get a serious amount of work done and actually have some accomplishments is actually one of the things that would dictate kind of what a natural tour of duty, what the centrality of this particular person within an organization is, might affect, so there might be different tours of duty for executives versus, for first line employees, these sorts of things. But the concept of saying, look, we know we're not going to stick our head in the sand anymore. We know that actually people change jobs, right? We know that they sometimes change companies. We know that we're trying to retain all of our stars, but we will only retain some of them. How do we make this much more rational and effective on both sides? And actually, as opposed to kind of holding ourselves to we're trying to retain everyone for their entire life, which is no longer the way that it really works. How do we make this work really effectively and actually take advantage of the new pattern?
Well, so then beyond the tour of duty, you were sort of referring to this already, one element is the alumni network, but we should probably get to that last because that's when they're the alumni. But the other is encouraging employees to build up their knowledge and their networks to make them employable going forward. What are some of how does that happen?
Well, so, in the HBR piece, we gave some specific kind of ideas and tips in order to how to do this. The basic idea is to say, first, have somewhat of a explicit conversation with your talent to say, here's the kind of tour of duty we want you to sign up for. You already do this. Like, here's some of the objectives we want. But in return, here are some of the things that we are trying to help with your career. Like, for example, we are trying to make sure that you are progressing in a good way, not just because you might progress to a really good position here at whatever company you happen to be, which is awesome, but also we're also just making you stronger overall in the field as part of what we're doing. Now, part of that, because I actually think, this is, ties to some of the patterns that we see as serious cycles for innovation in Silicon Valley. Part of the reason why the companies here are so innovative is we don't all just focus internally. There's semi-permeable barriers between the companies by which, you're not surprised if you see an eBay person and a Yahoo person sitting in a cafe talking about what is the nature of small business online, and how are small businesses using this and what should they be doing. And they're not talking about internal corporate information. They're not saying here's our sales numbers or here's our secret acquisition process. They don't say all those kind of secrets, but they will talk about here's the pattern that we're seeing changing in technology, here's the pattern that we're seeing happening in how they use search, and here's some things that we're thinking about how they engage with the internet as customers. And that actually helps both people, both companies, and makes it stronger. And it's one of the reasons why Silicon Valley is so strong.
Well, it's this environment where it's not clear who's your ally and who's your competition all the time.
Exactly. Well, and sometimes both.
Right.
Right. And so what that means for how you're managing talent is that you say, well, you actually want your talent to develop these networks. So you want to essentially say, like, for example, part of the thing that many companies, many groups, and LinkedIn included, do is they actually have part of kind of the group meetings is, what have you learned from the field? Like, in going out and talking to other people, and what knowledge from the world at large? Because mathematically, there are more smart, knowledgeable people outside your company than in. It's just a simple law of math, right? So what are you discovering from what else is going on that we can incorporate in terms of how we operate, what we know to do, et cetera? And then encouraging your employees to do that, e.g. to have networks that are broader than just within the company as a way of helping the company be innovative and adaptive as a function of it. And so you can say, hey, you can expense a lunch per week, per 2 weeks. You have meeting processes by which you say, okay, what are you guys learning from people outside? You can also be kind of going to, okay, what do you, for example, one of the frequent questions that I ask, like even if I sit down, for example, with someone who's a direct competitor with a company I'm involved in, obviously I'm going to be much more cautious about, what are the strategic plans? But you could still say, well, which technology trends do you see going? Do you see anyone using, big data is big. Do you see anyone using Hadoop in an interesting way? Well, that's a conversation you can actually have that can actually be useful. That sort of insight and skills, the radar of the world around you transforming, are the kinds of things that you want your talent doing, and you want to be helping facilitate and incenting them to do. Even though, by the way, and this is how it, always classically people turn into risk, it's like, well, if they know a lot of people outside the company, the risk that someone will come and recruit them is higher, but the way that you retain the wall against that is by having a great team, by having a great culture, by having, where the semi-permeable barrier is a net advantage to you as opposed to a disadvantage, right? Because they also know other people and know people to recruit and so forth. And that's the way you essentially manage this from a corporation perspective.
Well, in the article you cite Annalise Saxenian's book on regional advantage, which is about why Silicon Valley, and Boston, which was basically there first, is still Boston. Nice place, I live there, but what was the defining difference there?
So this isn't exactly the term that Annalise uses, but it's essentially open networks. So Boston was built on a culture where you essentially said on Route 128 is like you had only the kind of the corporate cafeterias, you stayed within your building, you didn't go meet other folks, you had essentially relatively rigid anti-compete laws, which, in terms of like obviously stealing IP and so forth is good, but in terms of like someone says, look, I have an idea for the company, is not going to do, I want to go spin out and start up a business and start doing that. Well, then the large company can actually, generally speaking, kind of create legal trouble for the small company. So it created a much less generative environment. Everything in Regional Advantage is worth reading. Everything in there is true. It's not complete, but everything is right, which is the part of what made Silicon Valley go from relatively a backwater to Boston to where Boston is in a kind of a entrepreneurial creation of startups and innovation is now actually way behind Silicon Valley. That is entirely due to the open networks. Is entirely due to the pattern that we're talking about, where people actually talk to each other about what do you know, what are you learning, how do you do that? Because part of how co-opetition works is the whole system gets a lot stronger, right? So like, yes, okay, you learned a little something from me, I learned a little something from you. That shifted our competitive advantage a little bit relative to each other, but we're fighting the whole world out there, and we're both now much stronger as a function. And that kind of thing made Silicon Valley a very, very powerful economic and innovation ecosystem.
Now, the other element is you talk about alumni networks. And as somebody who spent the largest part of my career in a pretty old line company, Time Incorporated, Time Warner, I mean, there's a big Time Inc. employee alumni network, but traditionally it was all these people who'd spent their entire careers there and wanted to meet to reminisce about their old times in the Paris bureau. And I think they have a choir. You're thinking about it in a different way.
Yes. So the key thing is it's remember the three trends were entrepreneurial age, the internet, and a startup review workforce. And if you consider these three things, that means that all companies are growing to have a much stronger alumni base than they've had before, given that shift. So the question is to really think about how do you deploy that in effective ways. Now, the leaders in this have typically been essentially services firm, because part of the way that they look at their alumni is as revenue generators, as potential clients, and that sort of thing. So they have a very natural and direct economic system to start investing in that before things like the internet was fully there and everything else as a way of managing this. But it's now true of all companies that there actually is a strong alumni base. And when you begin to think about the fact that how it is that you are adaptive and faster moving, you have to have better intelligence. You need to be able to solve problems or projects or create business relationships in faster and more effective ways. Alumni could be a really good way of doing this. And it's possible that things like the internet bring down the cost of managing this effectively in an interesting way, that then also, even in the cases where it doesn't directly tie to revenue, it actually still could have a good ROI. And so one of the things that I think all companies need to be starting to think about more seriously is, okay, how is it that we have a strong mutual relationship with our corporate alumni that isn't just oh look, they're in their HR database and we may rehire them at some day if we get around to it, right? Which is more or less a common practice.
This way of thinking about entrepreneurial employees and tours of duty, is this for the entire workforce, or are you just talking about your high potentials, people in certain kinds of management roles?
It's certainly high potential, but one of the ways that I define professional is people who can get better at their job. And so I think there are maybe some things that, like for example, if you're picking grapes, it may be that you can only pick grapes at a certain rate, and that's the rate, and it kind of that's what you're doing. Now you might move to managing the field, you might move to being a small business. Like there's ways to progress, but at that there's no way to and if that's your aspiration, then I'm not sure how much.
Move up to plums.
Yes, exactly. I'm not sure how much that arc, but most professions, you can get substantially better at your job. You can invest in what your skills are. You can figure out how technology is changing your job. You can figure out how the industry is changing, how you help your organization fit better against, because the product market fit or the services market fit changes in a competitive landscape, and you can figure out how to make those changes. And so I actually think it's quite broad. It may not be everyone, but I think it's more, by far and away, more the aspirational default than not.
One thing about joining a new organization is it can take a really long time to get up to speed on how to get anything done there. From the organizational level, I mean, do companies need to become more like each other? I mean, has that happened in Silicon Valley? Are there certain practices that are spread across the valley so that people can move to another place and relatively quickly get up to speed? Or how does that work from the organizational side?
There's a bunch of things, and actually, again, kind of because of the fast-moving, intensely competitive, ecosystem that Silicon Valley operates in, basically all Silicon Valley companies, one of the checklist items that when it starts getting to scale is they start actually working on essentially onboarding processes, boot camps. Like, how do you help people learn as quickly as possible? Like, as opposed to say, hey, you just give them a desk and say, hey, learn it yourself, wander around, talk to people, etc. It's like, no. We actually have to have here is the onboarding camp. The same way you might teach someone how to use a software tool or something else. Like, here is the work process. Here are the things we're doing. Here's the things we're working on. Here are the different groups. Here, to learn all this by going through collective boot camps. And part of the boot camp is not just like, oh, here's a video, watch it online. It's kind of a classes of people. So you kind of say, okay, you get to you run this class through, and then we make that class both configured by which parts of the organization kind of the functions, but also kind of onboarding. There's ways of doing that with college recruits. All the rest of this is a function. And so that's one thing I think you need to do. The second thing is I do think that one of the things that happens is amongst probably the vast majority, I don't know if it's all Silicon Valley companies, is there's this classic, like, what are other people doing that is really good on this? And how can we be improving in order to do that? And so it doesn't necessarily mean that the companies operate the exact same way, but there is, by the collective learning about what the best insights are, the really great ones then go across and form a bridge. Like, for example, most Silicon Valley companies actually have this kind of boot camp as a process. Now, some of them do it differently. Some of them say, well, take a month before you figure out which group you should really be in. Some of them say, no, you're already in that group, and we're running you through boot camps that are essentially related to how do you become effective within that group and effective within the company faster. But so it's not that the work process is exactly the same, but there is a meme sharing, particularly of the really good elements, that goes across them.
Now, this is going to be my last question before Dan brings the panel up, although Reid's going to stay up here and we'll keep chatting. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal, I guess on Monday, that raised a lot of eyebrows, citing a bunch of economic data showing that, at least in the US, some of these trends toward a seemingly more entrepreneurial, shorter job tenure economy had turned around 2005 or 2006. They haven't turned really dramatically, but still, after male job tenure, after declining for decades, actually has gone up a little bit. I guess your sense looking forward, does this feel like this pace of change might actually be slowing, or is this just sort of a dead cat bounce, as they call it in the stock market?
Well, I think the pace of change in terms of competition within the marketplace is not slowing. I think the trends of globalization, I think the trends of technology change, I think all of those are still apace. And I haven't done the research, this is a bit of an off-the-cuff speculation in reaction to this particular point. What I would think, though, is that part of it is you get to a natural human dynamic of, for this company, for this industry, for this job, for this kind of functional level and so forth, this, like, the tour of duty doesn't asymptote to a month,
right?
Right? It asymptotes to a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, because you've got to bring people on board. They got to work as part of a team. They got to get serious work done. Right? There is a period where you go, okay, this is a serious chunk of work, which works for both the company and for the talent, helps the talent seriously progress their career, helps them be lifetime employable, seriously advances the company over the long term. And the tour of duty is no longer, 40 years, right, or 45 or whatever the exact lifetime calculus used to be. But is now substantially shorter, but it can change, and it can change also based on all these variables. And so, but I don't think it asymptotes to, oh look, the trend is going like this, oh it just keeps doing it. So part of it would end up being I think as people begin to figure out what the right tours of duty are relative to all these variables, then it would naturally asymptote in those ways.
All right, thanks. Dan?
Thanks, Justin and Reid. I'm really excited about the next part of our discussion because a lot of what you've shared has been taking advantages that have taken place in Silicon Valley in terms of driving innovation through the way we think about talent and expanding them in a broader scale. And so we're going to bring up a series of leaders in their businesses with some have talent here and some have talent on a global basis, to talk about how might this transfer into their world and their reaction to some of these concepts. So if I could ask the panelists to come on up, and I'll introduce them as they do so. First is Howard Kravitz. It's over here. Howard.
Laughed.
What's that? Yeah.
No, exactly.
Howard Kravitz. He's the U.S. marketing leader at PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC. Joan Burns, over there, is head of resourcing North America at HSBC. Andy Hill is vice president talent and resourcing at Invensis. And Sarah Tilley from Disney, the Walt Disney Corporation, who's vice president of talent acquisition and global mobility. Back to you, Justin.
All right, thanks. After hearing Reid describe this new world of Silicon Valley, I think I'm going to start with Joan, because you're in an industry, the financial sector, where not only is there less of this, but like the regulators will come bite you to some extent if you do a lot of these practices, if you encourage your employees to be out there on Twitter and LinkedIn and being. How you hear this, when you read this and hear about this, how do you react?
Well, I think that, conceptually we use these thoughts and so forth with our external clients, very much so when, wealth management and things of that nature to bring in clientele for their banking needs and financial services. But bringing that internal is absolutely challenging. So it's very much on a muted level that we make these types of attempts. So we may, put someone on a special project, or we may, have them, go to another country for 12 months. The issues for us are around the regulations and compliance, as you mentioned, but also the re-entry and the sort of practical operational side of getting them to re-enter into a position that they believe is suitable for them, because the company's changed, the regulations have changed, the CEOs have changed, et cetera. So the ideas are there. I think we in financial services know that this has to be done and these concepts have to be brought in. We just have to find a better way to be able to accomplish that.
Right. I couldn't, of course, resist looking at everyone's LinkedIn profile this morning, and I think the person with the most tour of duty looking career path is Howard. So I just wanted to ask you a little bit about kind of going to the other end. I think you just started another tour with the same company a few months ago. Describe a little bit how that's worked for you.
Well, it's funny because I started off with an entrepreneurial spirit and failed so many times in business that I figured I better go work for someone else, right? And then, but that spirit doesn't really leave you. And I think what I've always tried to do is think about, you need to do the job that's in front of you today really well, or you have no opportunity for career advancement or change or growth or whatever your interests are. But keeping an eye on where does this go, and how do I evolve as an individual, and how do I bring value to either the company I'm working with or the ones I might aspire to work for. So I really don't know where that all came from in my being, but as I've coached others throughout their careers and as I work with people today, having a really strong sense of where do you want this to take you, and then how do we give you the experience that will lead you there. And of course, in professional services, for us, if it leads you there with us, great. If it leads you there elsewhere, then you'll either be a client or you'll be connected to our network, and you'll help us grow our network and our revenue stream and help us influence as well. But personally, I get bored. I mean, it's just that simple. I get bored. So I've always thought about what's next.
Well, you're in marketing at PwC. How do you, I assume you're out there trying to push your auditing partners, your consultants, all sorts of people to be more visible. And is there tension between that and the way the company?
There is absolutely tension. So, and we're made up of a number of different businesses. So it can be as I'm sure many people listening in today are. And so some businesses, very similar to the banking financial services, in the audit practice, it's we need to focus on audits and quality and worrying about our personal brand, and that's not necessarily the
You can't
top
tweet
of mind,
out
right?
what a great audit I had today of.
But what exactly, right? And here's what I found.
What a bad audit. Well, guess what I found today?
So
you'll read about it in 2 months.
But as our what the value that we provide to our clients grows in terms of our consulting capabilities and what we call our advisory business. And it now makes up more than most people would ever imagine that we drive in terms of revenue. The fact that you referred to us first as an auditor is a good example of what I need to change. Right. That particular side of our business, absolutely, we need to be front and center in terms of building our networks and using some of the things we talked about today. And we want to make catalyst hires. People who have come from other places, bring their network with them, bring that capability. We want those tours with us. And if we send them back out again, as we've said, great. But there's tremendous friction around how to manage that. Right? So.
Now, Andy, Invensys is in the business of making control systems, automation systems, measurement systems. So I assume there's a lot of very specific technical expertise involved. You're also not in the US, so there are different attitudes about some of these things. There's that famous story from a year or two ago about the guy in the UK who got fired for updating his LinkedIn profile. I assume you don't do that. It
wasn't me.
No, exactly. This was not at Invensys. It was at an oil and gas exploration company. He was in HR too.
It's getting closer then.
Exactly. I'm just it's sort of the question I asked Joan. It's like, you hear this, how much of this feels like something you can do and how much seems really hard?
Well, we had an interesting discussion with our leadership team about 18 months ago about LinkedIn. Because we were having our leadership conference and we had all our global leaders from all over the world coming in, and they said, what's the most beneficial thing of you all coming together? It's our network. We can get together, we can see each other, we can do that. And we sat back and I spoke to our chief executive with my HR director at the time and said, well, we could probably do something here. And actually, we did actually partner with LinkedIn to help us talk about setting up your profiles and how you could do that. We even experimented with some closed groups within our community to keep it going, and actually worked quite well. But what was interesting is actually people who were saying they had a LinkedIn profile in that exec team, and then actually when they came and saw us in the break said, well, actually, I haven't got one, and can you help us do that? But what was interesting was we had the debate around things like referrals and recommendations on recommending someone on LinkedIn. And if I recommended someone and my name's Invensys, if you like, or is Andy Hill recommending that person. And there was a degree of discomfort from the organization. Are we recommending someone who's talented? And that balance between your personal and professional profile is a challenge. It really is. But I think what it manifests itself in, I think, is over time, it's going to happen anyway. I think you've got to the reality of this is that the world is getting smaller and smaller. We're getting much more traction, ironically, in some of the markets that the likes of LinkedIn in terms of talent acquisition are not necessarily got a real firm foothold in yet, but the adoption of it is phenomenal. And I think from an organization perspective, we start to think differently now about, how can we network within our organization? And I think that we've got to do a lot more work. There's still a lot of people out there who've got a long tenure and the networks are very much internal. But I think Reid's point about thinking externally about how many problems you can solve. We asked ourselves the question about if we were trying to sort of come up against a bid against Siemens or a Honeywell, how many people in our exec team used to work there? So let's go and talk to it. Rather than actually internally we're sort of reaching out as well as externally reaching out. And I think there's a lot of knowledge in the organization you don't even know. And I think that so you've got to try and reach that balance. But it is a difficult one in terms of you think about losing talent.
Do you think technology makes it easier for you to find that information within your organization than it did 10 or 15 years ago?
It does, there's no doubt about it, but in question of who uses the technology and when they use it.
Right.
And I think that's the thing about when we use our LinkedIn profiles and when we actually tap into that and think about it, doesn't necessarily happen during the work hours. And that's interesting, but that will shift. If you think about the way emails change over time, that's not now how we communicate, but we think it is. I mean, my kids don't use email. It's as simple as that. They don't even know what it is. But we've changed that. But the dominant sort of communication in our organisation is that. So if we can start to think about how we communicate differently, when we did our first closed LinkedIn group with our execs, they didn't really use it because they didn't feel, well, I'm not going to go back to my desk and log in and go do that. So it's not necessarily intuitive for that generation. But the younger generation, and we think about how our engineers now, we have internal networks and we use social media internally for engineers to share problems and solve those things. It just happens. So I think it's a question of time. So the execs in my organization, over time, they'll disappear. And new people will come in, and the organizations around us will change. So I think naturally it will start to happen. But it's very difficult to convince someone who that's not a natural way of communicating to go and communicate. And I think they often hold the purse strings on some of the things that you're trying to do. So that does, I think, to Joan's point, that makes it a little bit difficult to convince people sometimes.
Sarah, at Disney, parts of your business are in this industry that's the ultimate tour of duty industry, where people sign up together for 9 months or a year and make a film and then all go break up and go somewhere else. And other parts are, other parts are very different. I guess the first question I have for you is just, how do you handle that? Clearly it's very diverse. There are parts of your business that you want to behave exactly like Reid's talking about, and others that,
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's a little more complex. So whether it's make a film or go to Shanghai and build a park, there are some places in our organization where it just more naturally occurs. Other places where retention is still important, within our organization. And then other places like our interactive business, where our mobile, social games, online, what Reid's talking about is more of a reality, and we have to adjust in order to accommodate that. So the proposition's a little bit different at Disney when you have 166,000 employees, and you do have to create a multi-tiered strategy. And we've started with internally just creating a more open market for talent, which, believe it or not, really didn't exist until the last couple of years. We leveraged LinkedIn quite a bit. We actually created a widget on our career portal in which people that are going to explore jobs at Disney can then find out who in their network that they know that already works at Disney, and that's been pretty powerful. And we've given our recruiting teams, we've empowered them to use LinkedIn to find internal talent that can be a match for positions. So we're really starting to evolve the culture internally, and then thinking about how we also do that with our existing employees in the specific area they're in.
Well, and that whole idea of as Reid was saying, when you bring up the idea of tour of duty, a lot of people seem to immediately jump to this idea of you're job hopping to different companies, even though it comes from the military, where I assume you stay in the same military on your different tours. That idea of, I'm staying within this organization, but I have a new task, a new thing to get done. Do you feel like there's more of that now at your company than there used to be?
Absolutely, and it is a little bit different. When you're dealing with a company that has such a diverse portfolio of businesses, very different from ESPN to consumer products to our television group at ABC, parks and resorts. I mean, very different type of talent, very different culture. So you have to think about, how do we create opportunities where we're leveraging proven talent and finding places that we can transfer their skills. So there's that component of it, but there's also the recognition that some people aren't going to be lifers at Disney. So how do we create opportunities, especially in our technology hubs within the organization, where we can value what they bring to the table for a period of time, and then encourage them along their career path. Maybe that's external to the company, and leave the door open for return. And I love what Reid was talking about earlier, where it's not just if you happen to come back, you come back. It's a proactive approach and strategy that seeks out talent that we want to bring back into the organization. So I will definitely be taking that back. And
Reid, if you have any questions anytime, jump on in. This idea of the entrepreneurial employee at Invensys, is that something that's been valued? Is that something you guys explicitly have looked for in the past?
Well, I think by the nature of what we have to deliver to our customers in terms of, we to stay ahead in our game, our products have got to develop. So I think by nature we've been innovative. We're 100 odd years old, and from the first metering devices, when you would say, have we lost some of our innovation? Are we up there? Well, I think we've had a very complex journey as an organization in terms of acquiring a lot of organizations and structurally what are we, our holding companies, what are we? And I think we're now much more focused as a business. We've sold our rail organization to Siemens, and now we're very much focused now on the systems and software side of our businesses. So I think we can now get back to that visioning piece. And I think, so do we value the entrepreneurs? Of course we do. Now, how do we do that? There's lots of different ways. Certainly within terms of our if you like, high potential performers, we have a program whereby we set real tasks, real questions about what we want to solve in the organization. It could be any kind of issue. It might not be a product, to get our high potential people go thinking about that. And I think that's really important, because I think one of the things I've seen here just in the last 24 hours, talking to some of the folks here who have, in LinkedIn, is they've got a very, very clear vision and purpose. They all speak the same language. They all talk about it. And I think if you want to drive entrepreneurship within your organization, you've got to have a sense of purpose, because you need to know why you're answering the question. You need to know why you're doing it. If it's confused and you've got lots of different businesses like we've had, that can get lost. And so,
and if you know the purpose, then you can sort of set people free to make their own decisions.
Well, I think you can set them free, but I think you've got to be careful about setting them free for what purpose. I think that there is that element, but I think that it gets down to your core personal needs as an individual. If I know I've got a value and I've got a purpose, and I connect with something, I'm more likely to stay and get involved and do that and go with that on that journey. If I'm not, now that journey may change and I opt out and I go and do that. So this Tory duty, I think, is actually a natural progression for most people. It's a question of sometimes in the past people didn't see the opportunities available to them. The world of LinkedIn now opens that up for everyone to see, internally and externally, can question it. But for large organisations, it is difficult to have to let go of people. It is very difficult on that, because you get involved in what I call the treacle of a corporation. So I think with certain things in pockets, we do that very well. But certainly, we don't have the kind of agility of a startup and the real core sense of purpose. And in 4 years' time, let's review exactly where we are. It's a little bit more complex. But it doesn't mean we can't think like that.
And you're a huge financial corporation that's been the product of a bunch of mergers over the last couple decades. Mm-hmm. How do you handle that challenge there, that idea of setting people free within a certain framework?
Well, yeah, I think that the framework is the issue, right, is ensuring that they understand within the given country that they're operating what that framework is, particularly in our securities business, particularly in our investment businesses. So you'll see more flexibility and creativity on the sales force side, but if you get somebody, who works in audit, or you get somebody who works in compliance, it's their job.
With that audit thing again.
It scared me when you said the word. So it is about the framework. So we absolutely try and find means to bring people's creativity and thought leadership out, but oftentimes, again, it becomes muted and diluted very much in financial services, because the regulators dictate to us the requirements now. So I'd say particularly over the last 18 to 24 months, we've seen that much more heavily than we've ever seen before.
So any specific things you're doing to deal with that, to try to both participate in this new world and not get the bank regulators all mad at you?
Well, I think we've done a lot with our culture itself, right? And our culture changes, and asking people to speak up and speak out and, let us hear your opinion, let us hear your voice, that type of thing. So we've gone that route to try and get people to have the freedom that we would like them to have, again, within the confines. So we're trying to build that culturally ourselves. And also, our CEO would say, have fun at work, which is kind of a concept for us at the bank, which is a stretch. But we are trying to find fun things to do with our employees more so than we have before.
There is one thing that would be interesting to run across all the industries. One of the things that's, for example, in the Silicon Valley ecosystem started, I don't know exactly how many number of years back, but companies started running hack days, right, where they were essentially kind of going, okay, let's to encourage creativity, we're focused on technology. Let's let kind of engineers and product people kind of pull out something that they'd like to do and kind of then demonstrate it. And what you've been seeing happen across the companies in the Valley, saying, oh, this is a really good way of channeling specifically kind of creativity, kind of like what could be done to help the business. And one of the things we're doing at LinkedIn as one part of that is we say, well, one of the problems with the general hack day is a lot of these projects just don't fit within kind of the really core strategic business, and so if people do them, we go, oh, that's nice, here's a prize, or here's some recognition. Now get back to the thing you were doing before as a function. So what we've been trying to do is to say, well, let's maximize the likelihood that this becomes part of what we're doing. So first is we sort of theme the hack day. We call these things in days, where we theme it in a way that we say, well, this is about what we're doing in the educational sphere, or this is what we're doing, regarding profiles or skills, or these sorts of things. Then what we do is we say, well, you run a kind of funnel by which and a bunch of people get time to do this, assemble teams, so forth, where they say, oh, this is the project I want to do. I'm going to assemble a team. I actually get work time to do this, and I do that. And then in the final area, we actually have executives, sometimes including me, judging it as a function of saying, okay, is this, and giving good feedback, so that helps with the employees doing this. Like, look, this are the things we love, these are the things that need some work, and so forth, so they can be learning, and that does their own kind of career and professional development. And then sometimes we go, okay, and that's something we're going to do, or that's something that we're going to add in some way, and that actually gets added to what we're doing as a corpus in terms of selection. Now, this is obviously fairly targeted at essentially our software practice, but I'm sure there are parallels, right? It could be ideas for how the business runs, ideas for projects could be done, that sort of thing. That sort of thing might actually be something that would also be interesting in the kind of the entrepreneurial ecosystem of kind of how you run internally. Anyway.
So building off that a little bit, and also to the previous comments, if you think about, so some of the things that we do at a place like at PwC, our ability to solve the world's most complex problems, businesses' most complex problems, is really how it's the fastest growing segment of what we do. So when you acquire talent, whether it's solving the supply chain for the one of the world's largest airlines, we won't talk about clients, right? Or it's a new social media strategy, or it's the new digital ecosystem. There are things that we're doing that most people don't think of us as being among the best in the world in. It's our problem. But when we hire people in, part of that compact is that you're going to get a chance to help solve some of the most complex problems that business faces today, which means, back to some of Reid's earlier comments about what happens here in the Valley too, we need you to interact with those networks. We need you to interact with the people who are facing those challenges. And then we need to give you time to think through, how do we solve those problems, and then where can we add value, and how do we help? So we commit time. We do bring days. We bring, we have names for the sessions. We call them catalyst sessions. And we bring our folks together, and we take some of those really meaty, challenging problems. And we need the input from our networks to be able to solve those problems. And sometimes we do them internally. Sometimes we bring our clients in to solve them. But that kind of energy helps create a more interesting tour of duty. And then when you solve the problem, we want you to be able to talk about it. And so the LinkedIn is a great forum to create that online, that social pact, that conversation, and those virtual relationships. We do not, one more moment, Justin, I'm sorry. We do not have enough feet on the ground, and I suspect most of us do not have enough feet on the ground to have as much connection as we need to grow our businesses the way that we need to. And so having that incredibly strong virtual social connection to feed that voracious appetite is critical to all of us. So.
Well, that leads to, you're in a pretty externally focused organization, in a very externally focused job. Are there companies, organizations out there who you think really are doing interesting things with this idea of how to facilitate entrepreneurial behavior by the employees?
Besides LinkedIn?
Yeah.
So yes, there are some companies that are doing it well. Some of the companies that we compete with are doing it very well, right? So, and I'm not going to say their names. We compete with them. So, I give them credit, but I don't have to give them that much credit, right? So, but I think the consulting space in general lends itself to this type of behavior. That we are all trying to create, manage networks, and some of us are better at it than others, and the alumni are a big part of it, right? Because We talked before, so we can say McKinsey. McKinsey is a company that does a really good job of bringing folks in and then turning them out into the marketplace and making them part of their culture for life. And certainly we aspire to that as well.
I'm going to ask sort of the same question of Sarah, just because you're in some industries where people are doing really interesting things with this. But also we're going to go to questions from you folks here and also those that have been sent in from outside. I think people here are supposed to use that mic right back there. So I would, if you've got one, I would advise going on to the mic. But Sarah, who or what kind of practices are you seeing out there that's like, oh, we need to work on that?
Well, first, in regards to entertainment companies that are doing it well, Disney. It's really the only one. No, I'm joking. But, the entertainment industry does have some similarities to Silicon Valley in that they're, people do depend on their networks. They leverage their networks, especially in understanding sort of what's happening, trends. I know, even within the corporate functions, I personally rely on intelligent, talented people that know more than I to get to have them weigh in on things that we're doing. I don't know if you noticed from my LinkedIn profile, but I actually came from Time Warner as well. So as you described, an online company, and there are some ways in which companies like Time Warner and Disney do need to operate in some of the more traditional ways. And I think when you look at a company like Disney, who have maintained that fortune spot for some time, we have to be innovative in order to remain relevant with each new generation. And the way that consumers experience content and entertainment has changed so much with technology that we absolutely have to figure out how we encourage that entrepreneurial thinking, that innovation in all areas of what we do, not just the more obvious places like those that design the rides or et cetera, but we do have pockets where we've said, all right, let's just create these kind of think tanks, and let smart people, and to what Reid was talking about, give them some themes, give them some parameters to work within, but then let them run wild, and one of our top mobile games, Where's My Water, was actually created by an intern, sort of in that model. And so, you're seeing pockets of it within Disney and within other large entertainment companies as well.
And I can't help but get in a plug here. In the same issue of HBR that has Reid's article, there's this really fascinating article about strategy that Disney is kind of the focus of it, is this idea that Walt Disney had this theory of the company, and that the fortunes of Disney have sort of waxed and waned and waxed again, partly because the company has a theory again, which is sort of what you're talking about. There is this sort of, this is what we're about.
Exactly, and it is, that's why I really liked what Andy was talking about in terms of know what it is you stand for. And Disney stands for, really the same thing across the globe in terms of touching the same, sort of human values, quality, trust, integrity, but the way that we operate our businesses, the way that we evolve our HR strategies changes from region to region naturally.
Dan.
Thanks, Justin. So there's a number of comments coming in online, and a lot of them have a similar theme, which is the concept of the tour of duty model is really interesting, and yet how do I get started? So there are cultural changes in terms of how companies think about talent. In many cases, tours of duty span silos in the organization. And so how do I work cross-functionally with my other partners to think about tours of duty in a broad way? How do people start this process? And maybe this is a question for Reid, and then I'm curious for those that are on the path, how has it worked within your organizations?
So I think there's a lot of work. I mean, it isn't like there's a simple cookbook process. This is something, as we understand how these three forces are changing the nature in which how we organize with the talent. I'd say the simple thing is to start thinking about, all right, how do I explicitly engage with an employee on here is actually a tour of duty that isn't kind of a yearly or whatever performance review, but is actually a function of, here's a set of major kind of developments we want in the company and in you, and here's also what we're doing in order to help you with where you're going, with an explicit notion of we may very well want to retain you for as much of your work life as we can, but that our relationship with you is actually to make sure that whatever you do, whether it's here or somewhere else, you are much better off for having worked here for that tour of duty, and we're much better off for you having done that as well. And it can start with a simple conversation, a simple set of kind of hey, let's talk about how what you're, because one of the things that we frequently do here at LinkedIn is, how is your career trajectory going to be changed by what you do in the next 2 to 4 years, and how is it, how do you play to make that happen, which is usually a do something amazing here, and then these are the ways in which your career trajectory changes as a function. And so it can start with that. You can make it more formalized in terms of your processes. You could, as I was mentioning, in terms of the network building, you can say, all right, I'd like people, you can say, look, go expense a lunch with someone else who's working in the industry and report back on what it is you learned as a function into kind of the group meeting. And these are all very small ways that you can start that.
Well, and the sense I got from the article is in a lot of cases you're just talking about this can just start with one manager and one employee. This doesn't necessarily come from on high.
Yes, it does. It certainly does not need to.
I think too, Reid references this in his article, but it's the company's responsibility, or if they are a responsible company, to create and showcase opportunities. There's also the employees' sort of part in it in terms of seeking out those opportunities and ensuring that their aspirations are known. And so I think it's about starting the conversation. It's also, as an employee, being willing to take some risk. So that means if there's an area that you're interested in, perhaps you are on loan to another area of the company for a period of time, and willing to again sort of take those risks and make it known that you.
One of the interesting things that I thought came up yesterday in some of our discussion was that in many cases these conversations it's not really company and employee, it's manager and employee, and so. How do we create incentives for managers to benefit in the way they're viewed by the company when their teams leave and go do amazing things elsewhere? And I think in a lot of companies, what I hear is often that there's a tremendous fear of the managers that people in my organization who are my stars progressing elsewhere is a loss. How do we turn that into a gain for them personally beyond just for the company? And it was interesting to hear some of the responses of how companies might do this. You were saying, Howard.
And I think, so as we progress as leaders, I take and most of the people I work with take the exact opposite view, that a high measure of your leadership is how you cultivate talent to move on within the organization or without, right? As long as we've done it correctly. And so, I think of a conversation, very, very personal, very recent hire and very quick story, and somebody I wanted very badly, and we sat down and I said to them, this is a 3-year maximum assignment for you. 2 to 3 years. Tell me what you want to get out of that time. Here's what I'd like to see happen to you. And here are the types of things that I think you can do when you're done with this. And I commit to actively pursue those opportunities with you. What do you think of that? And so in terms of getting a talent, right, I want the best talent possible. And I thought it was going to be difficult to get this person if I couldn't have that kind of conversation. And so as we coach throughout the organization as leaders, and the more of that we do, so how do you start? Like most things, people do this. You certainly can put systems in place. I'm not the HR person here, right? So I'm in the marketing and sales business, and I'm trying to figure out how to sell to the employees to come work for me. So that's, that works.
And Andy, we were talking about this yesterday as well.
Yeah, and I think from organisations we get wrapped up in, I say corporate trick or whatever it is, if you've got to try and work out these big programs to move people around organisations, and because so many things in the way around mobility to get that done. But I think it's a combination of what we've just said here, and I think it does come down to those individual relationships. And the best bit of advice, and it's always stuck with me, and it's how I've sort of developed my people who work for me, whereas the CEO of my last company said to me, when I was struggling, I was known as Mr. Resourcing in my last company. And I wanted to sort of move out and move broader into talent development, do other things. And I was struggling because I was the go-to person, and that was what it was. And so he'd always come to me, and that was great because senior execs came and God, I feel really good about myself, I feel valued. But he said to me, if you want to stop that, he said, you've got to stop doing at least one thing every year and give it someone else to do. And that's really hard when you own that as a manager, and that's what you're known for, and that's what you do that. So I think bravery of managers is very important to say, just stop doing that, find someone to do that. You can coach, you can develop them, give them the opportunity to go do that. And then that frees up your time to go do something different. So I think you have to self-manage, and I think the point Sarah made is really important. You've got to articulate the deal. And I think in Ventus, we're struggling to try and articulate that deal, but we will get there. We've started to say, let's join our people processes up. Let's start to think about how, we can educate people coming in on the journey they could possibly take. But it is a deal at the end of the day. And, the deal is, sometimes that deal gets broken and that doesn't always work, but it is a deal. But I think as managers and leaders, and a lot of people here today and maybe listening in and viewing today, you have the opportunity to just let go of something and give it somebody else. So if you got kids like me, you want to see them develop. You got to let them go. And I think that's what you have to do.
Well, I think it's really interesting, that point. I wonder how many of all of our employees understand that part of their role in this relationship is preparing for themselves to be taken out of their role and handed off successfully in the organization to someone else. And my guess is that that's probably less well understood than we would like our employees to have. Well, I think that concludes our session for the day. Thank you, Reid and Justin, so much for driving the conversation, and for all of our panelists for sharing your thoughts globally. Clearly an interesting topic. For those of you that haven't read the article directly, I really encourage you. It's the June article of Harvard Business Review. And thank you all for participating. And thank you.
Thanks.